have a quiet session.
Chucho, cuando sepas de Estefanos me avisas, ¿no? Por favor.
Él es uno de los ponentes de hoy día también, ¿eh?
Claro.
Ya estamos transmitiendo.
¿Doy la bienvenida o la das tú?
No, si quiere usted y yo doy alguna introducción ahí después.
Ok. Bueno, siendo ya las 11:09, iniciamos la sesión. Pedimos una disculpa por el retraso. Si hubiese algún problema, avísenos o quisieran alguna clarificación de ayer, avísenos. Le damos la bienvenida a los ponentes, a Gary Dymski. Nos acompaña la profesora Penelope Hawkins, el profesor Stefano Signao, sorry, I hope I pronounced it well. Y creo que ya está el profesor John Smithin. Again in English, I welcome everyone. We'll be starting in a few minutes. We had some slight difficulties in letting in the people. Things have been sorted out. So Gary is with us. So as the three discussants of the session, I thank them. And I leave the floor to Gary unless Jorge wants to add any comment to the beginning of this session.
Okay, thank you for joining us today. You know that at the end of the session, we have a moment for your questions and comments. Okay, let me give you the word to Professor Gary Dymski.
All right. Let me share this screen. And let's see, that's going to be screen number 1. And okay, wait, let's get that going. And then let's go here and here. Okay, can you see the screen? And you can hear me okay?
Just fine.
All right, excellent. So let's get started. Welcome to the second seminar, lecture of this 3-lecture series, 3 consecutive days. And again, let me start by giving my thanks to Noemi and to Jorge and to the team at UNAM for making this possible. I so value the role and importance of UNAM as a major intellectual force through the years and now in sustaining ideas that need to be heard and undertaking challenging and critical economic perspectives. And certainly we'll be talking about that tonight. You see the series, it's Uncertainty, Space, and Power. And tonight we're going to do, or rather, I should say maybe this midday, lecture 2, which is on spatial disequilibria and power imbalances. Last night we were working on some fundamental concepts, I guess, and at least the way that I'm trying to build some ideas to make this bridge between geography and the economy and economics. And tonight we're going to put these ideas into action. We'll return to some of the methodological questions tomorrow in lecture 3. But right now I'm going to dive into the way that people have been using these ideas. And we'll be focusing a lot here on the kind of contrast between sort of institutional Keynesian, even Marxian views of the way things work on the one hand, and on the other hand, ideas that come from mainstream perspectives. So just to begin with a dedication again, tonight I want to remember a dear friend, Fernando Cargim de Carvalho, who passed away 3 years ago. And he was an amazing force who, in a sense, made the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro a kind of force, a space for Keynesian economics, which in combination with Unicamp and USP and other places, really led to a kind of resurgence in the post-dictatorship period of heterodox thinking there in Brazil. And so he had a major role, was a very dear friend, and unfortunately passed away from cancer in Portugal 3 years ago. But he lives in our hearts and so on. If you're interested, I've written 2 essays honoring his memory and remembering his work. So I could share those perhaps if you are interested to read them. Okay, so last night we made some basic points. I'll just go through, just kind of whisk by this page that basically the spatial layer is always present. Real space is fundamental. And we're going to see the impact of real space today, the problem of irreversibility and so on as a key factor. And the fact that basically we have this interaction all the time between the macro and micro layers in ways that are complex and in which we cannot say that actually the macro layer is just a reflection of a sum of microeconomic transactions. The whole point is precisely that power comes into play in ways that are space determined and that have serious implications for who can do what when from different positions in the global economy. So let's then go to first of all, kind of just a one slide overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to focus on Latin America here, but we start by just noticing that from the 1980s until the present, as was discussed last night in the question time, we have this kind of debt-driven low investment growth period that we've been into during the entire period almost. And in particular, during this time, developing economies have had recurrent financial crises. This is linked to the deregulation of finance in this period as one of the things that's one of the motor forces of that. Basically, while this has been true, mainstream economics has basically, in fact, evolved. They've gone from moral hazard arguments to more bold arguments in a way. But both approaches, even while they've gone from a kind of micro foundational approach to more of a global systems approach, global financial systems approach, they both work with narrow frameworks that do not escape from some theoretical blind spots. And there's a bias of power at a distance that kind of pervades all of the perspectives that we see. And what we're going to do is to focus on 2 overlooked causal factors at work here. One is power relations and the role of aggregate demand that are shaping the global geography of macro financial processes. And we'll call it a global, neoliberal global triad. And the 3 elements here, I guess, are the hegemony of the US dollar, a shadow banking complex that's centered on too big to fail US mega banks, and the shifting global locus of manufacturing. So these factors are kind of the driving factors of what we see in the global economy today. It creates imbalances of trade and financial flows that systematically advantage some areas and disadvantage others. Latin America, with its frequent cross-border financial crises and its nation's systematic overborrowing of foreign reserves, reflects the workings and the consequences of this global triad. Now we'll start with just a few kind of images. There's some work by Levin and Valencia at the IMF. They've written several papers in which they're the keepers of the IMF's financial crisis database, and they divide into banking crises, currency crisis and sovereign debt crises, and they come up with different images of what's happened. Here's a picture from their 2018 paper showing that there's been many crises at different periods. But now if we look, we're going to, we see that if you take one kind of look, you see that there's crises all across the globe, even East Asia, Eastern Europe, South Asia, Western Europe, Latin America. We're going to come back to this picture actually and pick it apart a little bit later in the talk, because at this, the message of the IMF here is that a crisis is a crisis. Let's look at each crisis in its macroeconomic and regulatory context, find the common causes, and that will give us a universal explanation, and that in a sense, it could include the subprime crisis in the US, it could include the Argentinian crises, et cetera, that it's all the same thing. So basically, there is a global outlier here, something we'll come back to as we go through. Now, speaking of global outlier, let's look at Latin America, and what we see here are many, many crises. This is, through the period reflected in the 2018 paper by Levan and Valencia, and using their criteria for what constitutes a crisis. And if we focus in on the period up through 2007, we can see that indeed they are picking up some of the major events that we have in our kind of memories and in our historical experience. The so-called Latin American debt crisis, triggered by the August 82 default. We have then the Mexican crisis of December 94 and after, due to the devaluation of the peso. And then we see Argentina's major crisis there at the beginning of the 2000s. And one thing now, as we look at this is, what are the determinants of these things? How should we understand them? And here's just one slide that's going to be a kind of bow to the work of Sunanda Sen, if Sunanda is on the line. Sunanda, as mentioned last night, is a great theorist, as a Keynesian, and as a critic of imperialism. And what you see here is a graph I made a long time ago, but which resonates today. It shows, using BIS data, the claims on Latin American nations according to the, as a whole, according to the nationality of the lending banks. And what you see here is the predominance of Spanish banks and US banks in this pattern. And so you can see, this patterns of imperialism and imperial domination. If we were to go look at the parallel pictures for Africa and Asia, what we would see there would be other nations with their own imperialist legacies coming to the fore. In Africa, you'd see the British, German, and French banks far more prominent in play. And now these crises have had major consequences. In particular, if you look at the average GDP growth rates of this selection of countries, on the left for each bar, we have the US and UK, and then we go to three of the largest economies in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. And what we see there is, notice that in the 1980s, you see the virtual disappearance of growth in the Latin American economies. These are averages, of course, just based on the impact of that financial crisis of 1981. And then we see the continuing troubles then once we get into the contemporary period. Okay, now, mainstream explanations, going there. Basically, before the 1982 Latin American debt crisis, we had structural explanations. In particular, there was a profound paper by Diaz Alejandro, and Krugman talked about the so-called first generation currency crisis model. They talked about the fundamentals and how basically your trade patterns and your sustainability of your debt and so on could have a lot to do with whether or not you'd have a debt crisis. After 1982, now keep in mind that in that period, for the mainstreamers, you had the growth of, first of all, of the new classical approach taking over from the older Keynesian structuralist modeling. And in fact, by 82, the mid 80s, and by the late 80s, really defeating the old Keynesian consensus. And so, essentially this was reflected in that you switch from structural arguments to these, and on the macro side, dynamic equilibrium macro models, the so-called DSGE models. And on the micro foundational front, you have new Keynesians building game theoretic models that were explaining market failure using principal agent models, asymmetric information, and so on. And so moral hazard, the idea was, it comes up as the big explanation that these countries could pay, but they're not because of moral hazard. The borrower country chooses between repayment and default. The penalties are not big enough, and therefore, because we see defaults because the penalties must not have been large enough. They were set too low. And so that Stiglitz and his co-authors in that one paper end by wondering why sovereign lending ever occurs. So you have this kind of image of what happens. And the idea is that, well, you're trying to live beyond your means, you register your credit demand, you find a willing lender, and then you get into too much debt, and then moral hazard kicks in. And what this sequence of explanation ignores is basically to say, well, wait a minute, what about the original borrowing parties? What were we trying to do with that debt? The idea is that somehow the nation state borrowed. No, it didn't, but that is unimportant because structure locally is ignored. It all becomes just a simple explanation based on game theory. Now, some critiques were registered, including one that I did a long time ago, one by Darity and others, and so on, where we, talked about sort of some of more structural explanations based on class conflict and so on. But basically, these were never accepted by the mainstream arguments. Now, what starts to happen is that you start to have the IMF getting involved as the number of lending crises grow in the developing economies in particular. By the 90s, then you have Eastern Europe and so on. And then you have in East Asia. And so these economists, including Demogurko Kunt, Detriak Gach, and others, they start to basically see that, with these protracted, sharp, and frequent financial crises, they start to say, well, let's build a systematic time series of cross-sectional financial crises and look for patterns and explanations. Now they do that, and actually, what they find is no real pattern. Their studies really come to no single conclusion. On the one study, the 98 study, finds that a weak macroeconomy and high interest rates is the problem. The next study found that financial liberalization is the problem. It became a kind of explanatory dead end. If you follow the finance and growth literature, you'll know that that literature too has come to a kind of a thud. Thorstein, Beck, and other frequent contributors to that literature have found that they're now writing papers with titles like "Too Much Finance?" ? Whereas in the past they always felt that more liberalization, more finance was better. This was following, of course, the kind of earlier work of some of the earlier contributions to the literature on basically financial patterns, and really the belief that efficient markets work best. Then theoretical explanations sort of also throw up their hands. You see the second generation models of currency crises that really focuses on sunspots. The idea is that, well, if investors just change their beliefs, you'll have sudden stops. It's magical. There's no real structural explanation. It just happens. And actually, it goes a little bit like the analysis we had yesterday about Area 1 and Area 2. If suddenly all the lenders decide that they can no longer lend to Area 2, then they all pull out. If I think you're going to pull out, I'm going to pull out, so I won't be disadvantaged by your abandonment of the area. Now, we move from there to the final kind of phase of mainstream economics, which is something that we've seen right now, which is that we move away from the fitness of nation states. And even the IMF has adapted to some extent on, the IMF is now thinking about sustainable debt levels as opposed to eliminating debt. But we move instead to the idea of the very logic of cross-border financial flows as such. Now, the reference point for this work is the impossible Trinity notions that were floated back in the day on independent monetary policy, fixed exchange rates, and open financial borders are incompatible. That goes to the old Fleming analysis and so on, Mundell-Fleming. The thing was that, that literature again, around the time of the 1960s, really involved a debate between Fleming and Mundell, actually, about whether you could use financial openness to boost your economy, or was financial openness a form of disciplining your economy? Well, Mundell, who became then the founder of global monetarism and won a Nobel Prize for his efforts, he took the side of the financial openness as a form of disciplining your markets, and that in some sense we can then look at the global financial markets as sort of the ultimate embodiment of an efficient market framework. So the idea is that we can then move to show how there would be sort of, global financial crises. Why? Well, you have these funds who are moving across the surface of the globe, hungry for market share, hungry for returns, deregulated largely, lightly regulated at best. And Claudio Borio from BIS proposed the idea of self-reinforcing feedback loops between asset prices, collateral values, that leads policymakers to react to the financial cycle, not to the business cycle. And he has this idea that, well, we're getting more severe asset booms and busts, more severe business cycles, because as, in a sense, very rapid movements of finance leads to asset price changes that fool the central banks. We then get these overreactions that then damage the capacity of business cycles to do what Karl Marx always told us they should do, which is to clean out your capital and reset, and for that matter, Hyman Minsky, to reset your asset values. Now, Passari and Helene Ray in particular, however, basically have an even more extreme version where they basically say, look, the co-movement of gross capital flows, bank leverage, credit creation is so powerful that monetary policy has no effect. Don't even worry about trying to control your exchange rate. We don't have a trilemma, we have a dilemma. Developing countries' only choice is how open they're going to be to capital flows. So we end up with this, these kind of questions about what triggers financial cycles, what do globally mobile investors react to, what's going on, and we see kind of three explanations that have been proposed. One explanation, of global savings glut. Now you can see this is Ben Bernanke in particular blames a savings glut in Asia for the financial crisis in the US. And basically you can see that this is very much a classical, not a Keynesian viewpoint. The idea that savings constrains what's happening. There's too much savings. Now, another perspective that's really taken root is Caballero and Krishnamurthy and other theorists talking about the global shortage of safe assets. The argument here is that there's a global excess demand for riskless assets. The thing is, you need safety. You need money that you can have at the bottom of your globalized money markets that are hyper leveraged. What money can you trust? What assets are trustable? Well, the more secure countries, the countries that have powerful central banks that are able to react positively and strongly in crises, those are the safe assets. And so foreign savers can only find them in the US, primarily in other places, but most of the US. And basically, as they go there and seek them out, what they do is they then permit the US, or it leads to the US to have a current account deficit and leads the US to have an overload of risky assets. So basically, you end up blaming the victim, so to speak, and blaming the developing countries that are unsafe for trying to find safe assets and sending all of their money to this safe haven of the US. So savers are balancing their portfolios according to this view between risky and safe assets. And basically, this is something where I've got a quote here from Helene Ray, and she so much as admits that, well, we're working here with a neoclassical growth model, and it's behind many of our intuitions, and the free flow of capital could be beneficial. Financial integration brings improvements in allocative efficiency. Capital flows to places with the highest marginal product and better risk sharing, so the gains tend to be small. In other words, Ray actually has no problem with this situation of the dilemma, not trilemma. And basically, this, turns things around as noted. And as Catherine Dominguez of the New York Fed pointed out, this blames the underdeveloped financial markets, especially the emerging Asia, for the global financial cycles. The US has no responsibility. And this then, of course, is linked to this idea that we have excessively expansionary monetary policy. The idea is that domestic regimes have an exaggerated ability to deal with these things. They get fooled, it leads to outsized financial crises. So, we really see this kind of view that sort of moves to the idea that the global economy has a logic that nobody can do anything about. And if we like, we can wish that it was more Keynesian, but our Keynesian policymakers get fooled by asset bubbles. And on the other hand, there are some who say, no, we're just realizing the neoclassical growth dream. Don't worry, there's nothing to be done. Protect yourself if you must, but otherwise just live with it. So, in this view, here we are back to that picture, we forget a few things. For example, we're forgetting the fact that, let's see, financial crises, where do they occur? Well, actually, there are crises decades that explain, I've got these colored differently, green for Latin America, blue for the subprime crisis, red for the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and yellow for the East Asian crisis, that there are decades that explain, explain most of the volume of crises we see. But if we go outside of the decade of crisis, the 80s, we see that Latin America accounts for far more than any other area. Indeed, there's something else going on. So let's go to what it might be. And to do this, let's go directly to the kind of a post-Keynesian approach that takes into account power as well as uncertainty, and that looks at specifically at finance in this case. Now, if we just take the idea of power as the ability of one agent to force another to submit to a condition they would not freely choose, and we just begin by saying that Keynes' general theory is, and according to Skidelsky, it doesn't have power in it. You could word check it; it's not there. And Skidelsky talks about how Keynes refused to deal with Marx. Actually, in that 2013 book, Skidelsky says some pretty sharp things in critique of Keynes, which is unusual for Skidelsky, who's such an admirer of Keynes, to whom he's of course devoted his life work. But some post-Keynesians are now moving to recognize that it's important to recognize power and just as it is uncertainty, and actually that power can be seen as coming from environments in which there's uncertainty and hierarchy. These are the two categories they highlight as being especially important. Rochon and Monvoisin in particular, they show that agents who have positional power, the ability to set institutional terms, to set contractual conditions, can basically reduce their own exposure to uncertainty using their hierarchical advantage, their greater number of options, et cetera, to reduce their own risk and to expose their counterparties more fully to loss. Now, this kind of idea is, although it was not articulated as such, is clearly embodied by the Chick and Dow work on how the centralization of liquidity in crisis periods leads to credit starvation in a nation's periphery. Who suffers? Well, those who lack access to the resource that where they don't have the ability to control that. And so in financial markets, power arises not just in the capacity to control other circumstances, but, and we should note, but in a superior capacity to leave, superior access to liquidity. And here again, I'll just make a quick bow to Sunanda's legacy of work and that of many colleagues, Umiya Bakshi and other colleagues that have laid down this brilliant critique of imperialism. And just to say that these ahistorical or naively behavioral interpretations of developing country debt, this idea of, well, it's moral hazard, are facades for elites that are hiding behind structures of economic and social power. Developing country risk and subaltern positions in stratification structures, these reflect histories of power and control, especially by imperial powers that have taken land to build their edifices of exploitation. And here I know we've got David Barkin in the room as well. And David has devoted his career to looking at this situation in great detail in much of Latin America and elsewhere. We see these people and lives being replanted for gain. The upshot, as we're going to talk about later, is the problem of people being forced to migrate because they have no way to make their own living where they grew up and where they came to maturity. And the fact that when the plantations no longer require the stoop labor, when your factories don't need your inner city labor anymore, then you look at where there's unemployed people who don't have jobs, who don't have a way of making their money. And you can claim that these others who are not like us, the elite, well, they must have come there for the easy life. These are surplus people with deficits in skills and education. It's easy to victimize them, right? Now that, except when they can't breathe, of course, that's a reference to some of the explosion of protest in the Black Lives Matter movement. But this kind of thing of, again, we turn things around to see them from the opposite side. Now, what we need to do is to really grab onto the fact that there's an architecture of power in finance. To get to this, we have to, first of all, replace the new classical assumptions with a post-Keynesian framework, as noted, acknowledge the asymmetric power in cross-border relations, the fact that some can do what others cannot do. How many central banks can issue currency, or how many banks can make a loan in a currency that will be held freely by any person or any corporation anywhere else in the world? This is the currency hierarchy literature. The answer is very, very few. In fact, almost none. And so basically, this idea that what do you want to hold if you want to fly to safety? Well, you need a currency that you can take with you that conveys power. And real space comes in here too, in the sense that where are you willing to invest? Are you willing to invest in housing in your neighborhood, or would you rather get a condo in Miami or LA or the city of London, et cetera? And so, we have here what Richard Peet in the Geographer called a geography of power. And especially he points out that what we end up with in terms of finance is that the places that can guarantee safety or something like safety, the physical places, the real space, and the places that can guarantee your immunity from the consequences of real time, of liquidity risk, et cetera, the de-risking, that there's only a few places. It comes down to a concentration of power in a few spaces that, as Pete points out, can control a world of distant others. Now, let's go to a little bit of the history. In the triple banking crisis of the 1980s, which included, not the thrift crisis in the US, also the oil patch crisis, and of course, the Latin American crisis, the triple crisis, the US Federal Reserve demonstrated then that it had the will and capacity to support its money center banks. Too big to fail policy was initiated there in the 1980s. And it was initiated in the context of those crises, specifically, of course, reacting to, let's say, the insolvency de facto of the Bank of America and Citibank in terms of their loans that were then in default to Latin America, more than the capital they had in their bank accounts. Now, the US current account has, in consequence, has been in deficit since the 1980s. The US, while making this commitment to too big to fail banks, was under the Reagan administration, making an attack on its working class, paralleled by the attack on the working class and unionized labor here in the UK. And so there was the embrace of the global factory. This led to current account deficits and a capital account surplus. Now, we went through the accounting yesterday, and normally we'd say, well, the country that can't sell to the rest of the world, that has a deficit, must be in a weak position because it owes more to the rest of the world. It has to borrow capital from abroad. Well, this is where Varoufakis, in his book on the global minotaur, made just a fantastic insight to say that, no, this was part of a strategy. This was how the former hegemon, the US, that no longer was in charge of the global currency system with a dollar-based gold standard, or gold-based dollar standard rather, the US was able to basically turn this weakness into a strength. In a world of crisis, we now see the US as a safe haven. And so if you can move your savings, if you can buy assets in the US, that will be to your advantage. And so the fact that that demand for assets leads to a capital account surplus for the US is consistent with the US abandoning and attacking its working class and leading to this situation of this chronic current account deficit that the United States has literally had from 1980 until the present day. This has been weirdly, this imbalance has been a weirdly stable neoliberal structure. The neoliberal period referring to this period that we're in since 1980, the period of deregulation globally and trust in markets, but markets led and guided by one supreme central bank and one country that has been the epitome of a safe haven in this world of crises. Now, the result, as Jane DeRista has pointed out in her brilliant work over the years, is a global pyramid. Only one country at the top can stop crises when they occur across borders. So global holdings of US liabilities support financialization globally, thus increasing pressures that destabilize governments and increase the returns to financial predation and speculation. Now, we could go even further with this, and we may even, I think we'll do that tomorrow. It has huge implications for even what the central bank's role is in the global financial system. And it's to say, right now, it's not about intervening nicely when there's a crisis. They are at the base of the global money market every day. They are already recruited to sustaining the viability of a global financial system that demands returns that are unpayable in a world that is riddled with bubbles and unstable for that reason. So basically, this secular stagnation of the advanced Western nations, save for bubbles, has turned developing economies. That's the pattern in the advanced economies. And what that has done is to turn developing economies from current account surplus to deficit. Now, we're going to look at what's happened in the global situation, in the global economy. And we're going to look at basically thinking of yesterday, current account position. This now, current account, your trade balance. There's some wrinkles about that, but essentially what we have here is here are emerging market and developing countries who were in surplus we're looking here at 2004, and then we notice that basically that surplus declines to be a slight deficit. This is just taking broad groupings in the global economy. Then we have the advanced economies in deficit and now in surplus. Now, why is that? That's because basically there was the adoption of austerity policy here in the UK, throughout Europe, in most of the advanced economies. They adopted austerity policy after 2009. And as they slowed their economies, basically their economies go from deficit systematically to surplus. And there's different ways of counting this, but we can also see this very dramatically in the next slide. This has consequences for the international investment position of advanced and emerging and developing economies. The international investment position turns from positive, reflecting the fact that these countries were in surplus on current account and so on, to negative. Now, what this means is that these countries that were formerly basically, in surplus on trade, they had options. They now, however, as that goes down, and they're subject to, currency losses, to foreign exchange disasters and so on, they're now forced to borrow systematically in order to survive. This now becomes a global situation. The deficit of the emerging market in developing countries is basically a global fact. This is not theory, this is fact. So when we say that we have debt-driven growth and debt-led growth, and that growth is systematic in the global South, well, yes, it is consequence of the fact that you have this interaction between the macroeconomies of the global North, the advanced economies, and those in the global South. There's, as we talked about last night in a kind of joke, the Martians aren't involved. We got nowhere else to go. So we have this, asymmetric privileges of dollar dominance leading to this hyper-leveraged financial system. The US, backed by its international lender of last resort, and its currency sits atop this currency hierarchy, offering the safe haven. And basically what's happened is that, the markets have gotten deeper and deeper and exacerbated the gap between the haves and have-not globally. And this leads to a diminution of the financial power of other nations, even sovereign nations. So we can ask about any sovereign nation, can its residents use their currency in everyday transactions? Do other nations use this currency in their reserve stocks? Can it settle contracts across borders? Can this country settle contracts across borders in its own currency? Often the answer is no, right? And so this lack of financial status generates and sustains financial fragility and leads to financial instability. Depends on, the nation has to borrow, and it has to borrow from these large funds that are these kind of giant, I guess, big bears moving around the globe, looking for returns that really aren't there in a stagnant world. So they play a game of basically gotcha, sucker game, as they look to play zero-sum, games with one another. Now, this leaves us with a world that is actually, that I think is characterized by two hubs of global power. We now have a world of a financial core and a manufacturing core. And just to briefly visit and to introduce the role of Asia in this, and then we'll turn to Latin America and then conclude for the evening. What we have here is basically the locus of manufacturing power, that we haven't talked about that yet, really changed, right? It was once the UK, then was the US. Right after the war, the World War II, the US had more than half of global manufacturing capacity, but then both deindustrialized. And who came in was Asia. Well, first Japan. Japan had this export-led, state-led, state-guided model. But as they shifted away and their wages rose and so on, their firms engaged in foreign direct investment with other East Asian nations, so-called flying geese model. And this really challenged US supremacy. The industrial knowledge was spreading, and there was an improvement in East Asian education systems, urbanization, and so on. So prosperity came to Asia, goose by goose. Japan's rapid growth was threatening US supremacy, and conflict over trade emerged. And basically, the idea was that Japan had an unfair advantage. Its state-led model was not playing fair. Now, this was embodied in numbers of books. The two on the left side here, the middle and the left, were written by Westerners who were, contemplating why was Japan so powerful. And then on the right, we have the book by the former finance minister of Japan, Ishihara, who is basically saying, no, this is the Japan that can say no. Well, now that didn't work all, for long for Japan, in the sense that Japan was forced to back off at the Plaza meetings. The Plaza Accord was signed by force in 1985. Japan's banks, who'd become the largest in the world, refocused on domestic investment. This led to a bubble and a collapse in Japanese housing and share prices from which they've never really recovered. They're still kind of stuck in a kind of strange period of stagnation, a prosperous stagnation, but nonetheless. But this then shifted to the new phase where we saw China stepping in, and China opening its zones, special zones, playing a global role. We're not going to follow that further, but just to say that, China steps in and we have this hub of global production. You can see this where we look at, for example, global shares of manufacturing value added by country and by country group. And we see here's, East Asia, there's China, and there's Japan with a kind of declining share, and everyone else is down. And in particular, Latin America is down, and the United Kingdom is down even more. And I guess this is the same picture. Sorry for that. So what we have then is a situation that we could call, with this pole of financial power and manufacturing power, a global triad. There's the hegemony of the dollar, there's the mega bank dominated global financial system, and there's the global factory. So at one position is the financial core, the US itself, the safe haven, and so on. At the other extreme is the manufacturing core, East Asian, especially Japan, or especially China. These cores are, of course, interdependent. The US depends on East Asia's exports. East Asia relies on US consumer and investment markets. Other nations' global position can be measured by their distance from these two poles. You have the kind of the complexity of being Vietnam or even India in this. And so there's this kind of extensive peripheral margin, but basically where if you're outside, surviving is going to be hard. What are you going to make that's going to work? And so we have a situation that leads to global financial fragility. We have, as we know, that with Dymski financial fragility, there's a buildup of debt claims against entities that have finite cash flow capacities. But here we see, risk of countries, we see exchange risk. We have lots of risk being focused on countries that are outside of these two poles. And basically, in both places, you see immunity from speculative attack, largely speaking. Countries that are large enough to be involved in global markets and therefore market active can be vulnerable, because those are the places where capital will flow in and will flow out. And so if you're in that situation where you're going to have to take some action, you're going to want to have some defensive power if you can, maybe inward capital controls, maybe requirements on the use of foreign capital, but for sure you'll build up excess stocks of foreign currency reserves. And this defensive power is protection from speculative attack. And it's the power to be left alone. And we see countries building up excess reserve stocks that are irrational. Joe Stiglitz complained about this, but they're irrational unless we understand the context of power. So here's a couple of pictures. These are, first of all, current account balances for India and Brazil. And what we see here is that, both are in deficit positions. And so there's, this problem of deficits. And while we have deficits, you would think that, well, if you have a deficit, if you think of yesterday's accounting exercise, you would see basically a reduction in reserve assets. Instead, however, you would see what we see in India is an increase in reserve assets. And in fact, they're borrowing more. And in some sense, we can connect the dots between the borrowing more abroad, and now there's multiple motivations there, and what's happening. Now let's go then to Brazil. The same thing. We see net direct investment going out, but we see the buildup of reserves. We're financing a position in reserves for defensive power. And we see the same thing in Mexico, that you have to protect yourself because you're outside of the financial and the manufacturing cores. So basically what we end up doing is building up financial barriers rather than infrastructure in Latin America. We see patterns for Brazil and Mexico. These hold through all of Latin America. And this subordinate global position means that you're, making primary exports to the imperial center. You have underdeveloped industrialization, a dependency on other nations' industrial exports, and you get trapped, as we were talking about yesterday, and we were talking with Noemi after the lecture. You get trapped in this cycle of uneven development, as Prebish and Furtado and others talked about, the inadequacy of a capacity to accumulate capital. There's not a proper industrial sector. There's a lack of industrialization, a dependence on exports from core countries, and dependence on the U.S. dollar. Peripheral position, right, combines with this dependence on commodities, exporting commodities, it creates extremes of wealth and poverty and ever greater financialization. So here's, current account erosion and reserve assets, just the naked picture across Latin America. It's brutal, right? The current account goes down, recovers a little, and then the reserves holding other people's money, those safe assets, there you go. And here's the net investment position, a similar picture. So final substantive part here to be made, a couple of points, that we have the Latin American financial trap. The two arms of this trap, on the one hand, the deterioration of the current account and the oscillation due to commodity dependence over the last 20 years. And then on the other hand, the other arm is the weak currency of these nations, forcing them to build up stocks of reserve assets. So the global mega banks here, the shadow banks that surround them, play the role of kind of guard labor. They basically will implement financial attacks to take gains, zero-sum gains, when these nations are exposed to global financial fragility, when they show any weakness. Look at the Bolsonaro regime in Brazil, a ridiculous regime, and investment flows in and flows out. It's a game, right? But basically it's linked to this guard labor role of ensuring that we don't try to go back to whatever it was those PT leaders were trying to do. Wasn't that socialism? Now, it's not the poorest nations that are the targets in this zero-sum speculation. It's the nations in the middle income tiers that are exposed. Latin American nations are nearly uniformly in this. They're now, right, an asset class. So Borio's notion that excessively expansionary monetary policy is the cause of the global financial cycle doesn't apply to Latin America. Its banking systems, as if you go back and look, have been remarkably crisis-free. But Latin America is exposed to the free movement of excess financial capital seeking bubble-driven growth opportunities. You could think of Rosa Luxemburg here and her analysis, or say, Magdoff and Sweezy, and that kind of thing. And what Ray and her co-authors ignore is that the U.S. doesn't just provide safe assets, but it basically requires that it's backstop, that these are backstopping its mega bank dominated shadow banking sector. So we have this situation where the US is in a unilemma. It has to maintain low interest rates, absorb unwanted financial assets, and sustain liquidity. This is not a choice for the US if its position at the center of global financial power is to be sustained. Read Tooze's book about the great financial crisis. You will see that they bent over backwards to save their financial system. And they had to do that. Otherwise, the US loses the one card that it has, the status of safe asset, the status of being the place that's beyond crisis. And basically what we see is then these feedback loops that then have domestic implications. This will be my final set of points here, that national governments in the West in the global West are then between these force vectors. Owners of globally mobile capital want stable returns, and their citizens and residents need well-being. But the increasingly severe financial crises, forces everyone to kind of be disciplined and so on, except for, again, the US. And the policies that are needed and for circuits of globalized capital and wealth diverge from those required for preserving communal well-being for most people. States' capacity is ground down. And so we have this situation where the conditions for conflict are sown, worsening conflicts over resources inside nations, playing out across these intersectional divides of race, ethnicity, national origin, region, and so on. And so, we see blaming the other arising in national political discourse, speaking here especially of the US case most dramatically, perhaps. And those in the subordinate rungs are squeezed hardest by welfare cuts and unemployment. And so we see this problem of those with intra-society positional power, when reminded about this, they say, well, it's just identity politics. And, let's look at the average white man. Well, yeah, the average white man is not doing well, but nobody's doing well. And basically, policy mistakes. So you tried to let Black people own houses. That was your mistake. But actually, state interference with market processes is pegged as the ultimate source of crisis, ratcheting public services downward. Stratification identifies groups that you can target, and you can blame, and so you have this political disenfranchisement, invisibilization of those who are subject to the crisis most severely. This leads to these blame the other dynamics that get fed and are alive, of course, even today. I'll just show this famous picture from like 3 days ago on the Texas border, Haitian folk. And basically, it leads to these two different provisioning crises. Now, just 2 more slides and I'm done. On the one hand, we have in the developing countries, financialization increasing, buying time, as Wolfgang Streeck talks about, but contradictions are mounting. But the ability of these countries to provide for their populations is threatened and in sharp decline. And so there's rise of political repression, scapegoating, nativist movements that deny reality, all this kind of problem. Meanwhile, flows of refugees and economic migrants rise rapidly. And, we see by the contrast in advanced countries, governments can't reassure their embittered citizens. They can't keep the human services going. The NHS is in trouble, this type of thing. They can't keep the guest workers out because they need that low wage disposable labor. Otherwise, there'll be shortages, as is now being realized in the country I live in now. And so, you see this problem, again, of polarization of views. The situation is beyond emergency. Here's just a picture that illustrates that the global stock of refugees and international migrants has been growing systematically, dramatically around the world. And consequently, as we see that, we see the flow of remittances as something that countries depend on, flow of remittances out of the Eurozone, US and Canada, and so on. And basically a situation where, we're on a boat and we might die, but we have no other choice. So in conclusion, this post-crisis literature argues that there's an unstoppable force that limits the autonomy of national macro policy. But we've talked here about the fact that no, there's other factors going on, structural factors. And to get to these, we need a Keynesian analytical foundation that pays attention to power. Within this frame, Latin America's subordination becomes clearer. Currency instability, the withering of manufacturing, the dependence on foreign capital and credit, the need for foreign reserves, et cetera. This is a consequence of this asymmetric structure of global financial power in the midst of this world with this polarized structure of global manufacturing and trade. The support pillars sustaining this system, which create and recreates global financial fragility and imposes stagnation and losses on people throughout the world. That is this global mega banking system and the key currency central banks remain in place even as the political foundations of the global order are giving way. Thank you for your attention, and I'll stop here. Here's a few references, including a paper written with Stefanos about the big banks, and I will stop here and stop sharing my screen. Thanks for your attention.
We would like to thank you. A very nice presentation, very clear. I think what's next is the discussant views. Stefanos, I know. Can you pronounce? Sorry.
Janus.
It's all right.
Okay, Janus, it's easier for us. Thank you.
No worries.
Let me introduce you. Quiero agradecer al profesor Gary Dymski por la presentación. Enseguida estarán los comentarios del profesor Stefanos Ioannos. Permítanme rápidamente dar una breve bibliografía de el profesor. La pongo en inglés. I will put it in English while I'll say the same thing in Spanish.
Not a problem.
Es doctor en economía por la Universidad de Leeds bajo la supervisión del profesor Gary Dymski y el profesor Malcolm Sawyer. Es profesor de economía del Oxford Brookes Business School. Sus principales líneas de investigación son macroeconomía, economía política, banca y financiamiento y geografía económica. Ha publicado en una amplia variedad de revistas indexadas en las que se destacan Economic Geography, Urban Studies, Metro Economic, Review of Political Economy. Está involucrado en una amplia variedad de proyectos de investigación interdisciplinarios dirigidos por la Universidad de Oxford. Específicamente en el proyecto de ciudades y redes financieras globales, financiamiento y desarrollo en el siglo XXI. Llama la atención que en este proyecto se estudian los cambios post-crisis del sector financiero global y los centros y el impacto del financiamiento y el desarrollo, así como el papel de la tecnología. En la Escuela de Negocios de Oxford Brookes dirige una serie de cursos que cubren los temas financiamiento, desarrollo, comercio internacional, mercados de trabajo internacional. Anteriormente fue profesor de la Universidad de Cork. Okay, we shall give you the floor. Please go ahead. Sorry, Jorge, you want to say a few things?
No.
Just
Professor
to-
Stefanos, you have the stage for you.
Okay. We remind only if any question, please make it to the chat, or at the end you can do it personally. Go ahead, please.
All right, muchas gracias. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, just a few thoughts to add to what Gary said and to support and also expand his presentation, his thoughts. One, at the analytical level, so Gary mentioned the core periphery scheme that Victoria Chick and Sheila Dow, amongst others, talk about, where you have this kind of, big city in a country vacuuming the wealth, the resources from the rest of the country, from the periphery. Then you extrapolate that and you go to the global scale where you have basically nations, entering into the game amongst each others. And instead of having the one big city, now you have the US. There is also what is very interesting, and where there are a lot of contributions from financial geography particularly, is the combined scheme where you have those big cities not only operating nationally, having this core periphery model within national borders, but also looking at it from the global scale. And what I'm referring here is global financial centers, cities that function as global financial centers, which ultimately what happens there is that those cities come to, on the one side, diverge more and more from the economic trajectories of the rest of their countries, and at the same time form networks of their own. And there is a whole literature about global financial networks coming from financial geography. The implication of this, amongst others, is that ultimately, Gary said that power resides in a few places. Now, if we see this kind of, if we go to the global scale, but starting from the urban scale, we see that those few places are actually even fewer. And two, that those, concentrations of power are even, at the global scale become even more solidified. And also bear into mind that at that global scale, when you think of global financial networks, you can also think of offshore financial centers. So ultimately, you don't have just the big city in a country vacuuming resources, which otherwise stays in that country, but ultimately the country losing those resources altogether. So that's a point at the analytical level. Now, at the empirical front, Gary talked about currency hierarchies, and one, for me, a very simple example of where you can see, where the importance, where the currency hierarchies are manifested is the COVID-19 pandemic. On the one hand, that thing at the monetary front, reflective of the status, of the global status of the US dollar, is that one of the very first things the Fed did was to ease access to dollars for other central banks with which it maintains swap lines, amongst which also, to the best of my knowledge, is also the Bank of Mexico, right? So already the step one was the Fed preparing for a surge in demand for USD being, for US dollar denominated assets. Then at the fiscal front, again, just watch the news. Only the US, you have trillions of dollars pouring in the economy for fiscal support, uncomparable to any other country. You have other countries, such as the UK, also despite having a conservative government, but especially in the very first wave of the pandemic, those people were quite Keynesians in a very kind of pure, arithmetic sense, if you like. They poured a lot of money in the economy. And then you also have the paradox of, at the same time, having the European Union in a more mixed situation. Now, coming to Europe, my next point is as follows. Basically, it would be wrong if we only think of developing countries when we talk about developing countries. And here, there is a very peculiar situation of the Eurozone, where you have the euro as a currency. If you were to take it at the continental scale, you would think, Gary had this kind of, boxes to tick, namely, do the citizens of that area use their own currency? Is this currency in demand as a reserve asset, and so on? If you think Europe as a continent, the answer would be yes to all those things. Europeans use the euro. But if you go down to the national state, to the national scale, and you think of particularly Southern Europe, Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal, then you have a situation where those countries become much closer in resembling developing countries in the sense of not controlling the currency that circulates in their economies, in other words, being deprived of monetary independence, despite being classified officially as developed. I come from Greece, so maybe it's a bit of a bias here, but Greece stands as a very recent and very clear example of subordination of a sovereign state on the dictates of global financial markets. So you don't just look at Argentina, Latin America, Asia, just, look at Europe. You have Greece, and it was not just Greece involved in the European crisis, but Greece, more than any other country, had to enter into that, subordination where, it had to go a long way in implementing what would be, quote unquote, responsible macro policies, call it austerity. And Greece is also very interesting in a number of other fronts. So again, Greece was not the first country to be bailed out by the IMF. Greece was bailed out by the so-called Troika, which was the IMF together with European institutions. But it is also interesting to see where that money that came as a kind of rescue package for the Greek economy, where it went. And here, a very good friend of mine, a colleague whose work I respect a lot and appreciate a lot, Professor Pablo Borg, has published a paper putting together the numbers, calculating how much of the money that came to Greece actually went towards supporting the real economy. And the end result was that basically out of the total, something like 130 billion euros 93% of that, in one way or another, found its way towards original creditors or towards bank capitalizations. There was a small share that went towards repaying the Troika itself, and it was less than 2% of those funds that went towards the real economy. Gary also talked about racism, xenophobia, and again, look at Greece. With the crisis in 2010s, we had a rise we had a party entering into parliament and at its peak getting 10% of the vote, a party that was openly that would openly see itself as a neo-Nazi party with the symbols and all that, and with Hitler's posters in their offices. Golden Dawn, thankfully now their leaders are in prison. That was a major trial in Greece, which came to a conclusion last year. But it shows how those things, they happen, they're real, and they're ugly, and we don't want to be there. Greece is also another interesting example in one more way, that it also, due to its geographical positioning at the very east of Europe, comes to be the recipient of migrant flows from Asia, from countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. So Gary talked about imperialism, and it is an emotional term in a sense, but we don't have any better term to describe what imperialism describes. And in that sense, what I would add to Gary's is that we should not only think of, this financial fragility leading to subordination of sovereign states, which ultimately come to be deprived of the resources to support the well-being of their citizens, but also let us not forget imperialism's role and the war in producing those migrant flows at the first place, and then you have the two together, and then you have the mix. So yeah, that's from my side.
Thank you very much, Professor Stefanos. Now we have time for you, Professor Gary Dymski, to give us, I don't know, a replica for the comments. I don't know.
Yeah, just a few comments, and let's open it up. First of all, let me, if I might share my screen for a moment, let me show something. It's a paper that I'll make sure you have it. It's a paper I never published. Well, I published it at the Levy Institute. Are you seeing something like a page right now from yesterday's lecture? Yeah. Okay, let's go full screen. Come on now. Okay. Back again, I had just been in Japan and Korea during the East Asian crisis time. I spent some time there and came up with a paper in which I was trying to spatialize Dymski. And of course, I was also coming from California, where boom bust logic was, is very heavy. And so following Stefanos' first point, what struck me exactly as he was saying was that we need to look not just at, national flows of money and wealth and liquidity and so on, nation to nation, but then inside nation, it makes a difference too. Now that paper, at that time, I wasn't really sure what to do with it. I ended up just making a working paper. It was really right between geography and economics, so to speak. And so I didn't pursue it at the time in terms of publication beyond that point. But what the paper does is basically say, you have to look, you want to look with this cross-border perspective at two kind of things. On the one hand, are you receiving foreign savings from abroad? Is there money coming in? This would be like, here's the US case. Money's coming in across your border. And then there could be, countries that are wealth exporters, or excuse me, that are net exporters, like say Japan in that case. I was writing this paper at the University of Tokyo, would be in the case that they had a current account surplus, and so they would be having wealth outflows to balance that, or building up foreign reserves. On the other hand, then look along the other dimension. What about inside the country? Where does the money go? And this is Stefanos' point. Well, where's the money going inside the country? There are regions that are building up more and inside the country, and regions that are building up less. And so actually, if we take a look at the boxes, here's let's say, just let's focus here on the US cases that were there in that example I was playing with at the time. You had basically money coming in from abroad, and again, sitting in the California, at that time I was teaching in California institutions, University of Southern Cal, and then UC Riverside. And, we were watching, Japanese investors come into California and buying up downtown real estate and so on. And this was shocking at the time. Of course, later it turned into the subprime finance boom and so on. But essentially, you had then the, money flowing in, housing prices, real estate prices rising. This happened in Korea as well. With, at the time there was periods where they had a deficit because their East Asia, Korea, and some of the other countries, Thailand and so on, were so popular as investment sites then that they actually had more money flowing in to take advantage of the boom in kind of, production and urbanization happening in places like Bangkok and Seoul, that they were in deficit on current account. And again, where did the money go? Well, it led to a bubble in Seoul and so on. Meanwhile, inside the United States, other areas like the US Midwest, the housing prices were never being affected because the money wasn't going there. And this pattern of, Tokyo separating from the rest of Japan in terms of asset prices was also then reflected in Japan. So that, just to say that there's a lot there in terms of working with Minsky and ideas. I appreciate, and then linking that to some of these really important ideas about financial networks among the geographers. About these swap lines and the empirical side, currency hierarchies, I would just note that something that is very important is the fact that those dollar swap lines, which you can read about in Tooze's book, that as having been created in the context of the first of the subprime crisis, and then Tooze's newest book kind of continues that discussion. They didn't give swap lines to every country; only certain countries got them, and that was a kind of peripheralization within the periphery. Who gets the money and who doesn't? Just in reaction to finally a couple of points, Pablo Bortz's point about that brilliant research on who gets the money. Actually, Jerry Epstein has some brilliant work with a student whose name I'm forgetting right now, that basically shows that most of the money that's lent by the financial sector goes to the financial sector, kind of a parallel point that, a lot of that money is circulating inside. It's finance taking off on its own. I remember asking a question to Jan Toporowski in a recent conference where we were like, Jan, is there any limit to this? Could you have finance paying for finance, or finance, paying finance, paying finance, paying finance? Well, as long as nobody stops the carnival, right? I mean, there's structural contradictions going all the time, but essentially, if you have a Federal Reserve willing to bail out these, these people using tax shelters and so on, then until that capacity is wounded, there's of course where we get into some of the geopolitical developments. And finally, I would just point out that vis-a-vis fascists and neo-fascist parties, right now the Republican Party in the U.S. is in the fight for its soul. Tomorrow's dedication, weirdly, will go to some of the political resistors to the Trumpian movement, and there will be a joke even about my home city of Philadelphia, but actually a nice, good, bitter Philadelphia joke. But we're looking immediately at the case of Germany, where I read in the Financial Times, I think it was, that the neo-fascist, neo-Nazi party there, with again some of its leaders in prison, is still at about 11.7% of the vote. Now the CDU, you had Angela Merkel stepping in today, Angela Merkel trying to influence, so that the CDU, the Christian Democrats, would come back, and that her, attempted successor would succeed, but it's not impossible that that nobody's going to get the majority, in which case does somebody take, because those AFD, they're going to be in parliament. Do you make the devil's bargain and embrace that right wing in order to that right wing that goes back to the darkest days of Germany's past and open the door to them? Compromises were made in 1933 with amazing consequences. That was a minority party, the Nationalist Socialists right then. We need to be careful. We're on very dangerous ground right here globally. I mean, we can sit around and talk about, the climate summit and all of this and the G20 and all those nice thoughts. But right now, I don't see any global leadership that's capable of bringing the whole world together. That's something, unfortunately, we're going to have to talk about tomorrow, is how do we find pathways forward? Thank you, Stefanos.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Stefanos. We open the discussion. Abrimos la discusión. Gracias, Gary. Gracias, Stefano. Tenemos alrededor de 5 preguntas, creo, en el chat. Pregunto, ¿sabes si están habilitados los micrófonos, Jorge?
No lo sé, le dije a Chucho que los habilitara. Déjeme preguntar. Okay.
Por de pronto, a ver si Gustavo nos está escuchando y quiere hacer la pregunta. Parece que no, la hago yo. Gary, I will read the questions. I will go 3 by 3.
Okay.
And in order that you will be able to answer. And in the 6th one, I want to ask something.
Okay.
Gustavo Gutiérrez, you have them in the chat anyway, Gary. Thanks for the presentation. Pregunta profesor. Lapavistas define subordinate financialization as a change in capital flows from the periphery to the center, though the accumulation of international reserves by central banks. I lost it. Sorry. Where? ¿Dónde está? Aquí. Sorry about that, but okay. No, la puedes dar tú porque la perdí. A ver, aquí está. Sorry. In addition to the flow of capital from no sé qué dice. Do you see the question? Because I
do.
Okay, so the second one is by... ¿De quién es la segunda?
I think is from Diego Molina.
Diego, do you want to make your questions directly? Diego, ¿quieres hacer tu pregunta directamente o la hacemos nosotros?
And now you can open your video and your audio wherever you want to speak. No, mejor dígalo usted, doctora.
Creo que es la de... ¿En cuál estamos? La segunda es la de... Perdón, la segunda es de Celso.
Aquí está César.
César, adelante, por favor. Ya te vimos. Por favor.
Gracias, doctora. Hi, Professor Dymski.
Greetings.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
Great presentation. I was thinking about the notion that you speak about the hierarchy of currencies, and I would like to know your opinion. Do you consider that the appearance of cryptocurrencies and other kinds of alternative currencies are a kind of response to this hierarchy of currencies that try to circumvent in a way this power that these official currencies have?
Let get another one. Celso Alan Villegas, ¿estás por ahí? Well, hi, Professor Dymski. I have a question. Is there any relation between deregulation of financial system and distribution of income? Which one which ones could be the channels between those variables. So we said 3 by 3.
Okay.
And sorry, do you think that the growth of financial system generates a reduction of industrialization?
That, you know, let's go through these in order, I think. First, Gustavo's question on subordinate financialization is actually referring to some of Kostas Lapavits's work, and actually that, you know, it seems that Kostas and I are on the same page in terms of viewing this over-reserving by central banks in emerging and developing economies as one symbol of subordinate financialization. Are there other factors that could explain it? Well, I think actually there are in some sense. One thing to look at would be what's the country's exposure to the so-called sudden stop of financial flows. So, you know, are there capital controls or not? So what about foreign investors? Are they free to enter and to leave? That would be another thing to look at very carefully. And then in addition, what are the permissions or the restrictions on the investment alternatives for the domestic population, especially the wealthy elite in different countries? We know that part of the Bolsonaro movement in Brazil was generated by the fact that the wealthy elite that often owned second homes in Miami and was able to move its money across borders and so on, that this elite got angry about the fact that even people that were, in some cases, their domestic servants were also vacationing in Miami and going to Disney World. And that was, seen as a real, unviable situation. Now, had that elite not been able to move its money freely, then their capacity to basically move the money out would have been compromised, would have been reduced. And actually, one of the factors, if we read some of the Brazilian analysis about what happened, I'm Latin American enough that the solution is always more coffee. But one of the factors there was the fact that it was Brazilians who were moving money out of the country was one factor that was undercutting the real. That was actually something that was like a booster in. When Bolsonaro comes back, I move my money back in, and then I move it out when I'm against Lula or whomever might take over next from the PT. So, this kind of factor of the permissions and the framework and the freedom to move money is another thing to look at. And the final thing we would say there would be, take a look at remittances, because remittances are actually very important. And now, if you think of it, then if we have workers, let's say from Brazil, who, let's say, are living in California, we used to, have many Brazilian friends who we'd all go to a Portuguese mass together, and they were working there, most of them undocumented, in California. Now, those were people who were sending money home to Minas Gerais. So if you think of it, that was a source of demand for reais, insofar as, dollars are coming and buying reais. It's not reais, looking for dollars. It was the opposite case. So the remittance flow actually, when it's in that direction, moderates the pressure on the subordinate currency. As, however, like the economy slows, like many of those Brazilians that we knew in California were active in the construction sector. Now, the construction really slows down with the COVID and so on. And so that means that there was more enforcement, more people being deported, and that too would lead to the subordination. So that's one of the other factors that feeds into the subordination of one country currency and finance versus another's. Now, for Diego, we have the question of, let me go back to the question, let me see it here, about about the decentralization as a possible way to moderate the situation. Decentralization, in some sense, I think it's fair to say that decentralization is already a factor in Latin America, in the sense that the cooperation and sharing amongst the countries, currency union possibilities, or let's say synchronized regulation, country by country, something like, say, the Europeans, for better or for worse, with the European Monetary Union, then the European Union, the Europe trying to synchronize its regulations on finance and so on. We don't see anything like that so much. So I think I would argue that we already see we see a lot of decentralization of policies in Latin America. And I think the question would be, can there be some collective strengthening by, again, if we go right back to the financial subordination question, could you see a strengthening of the ability to resist some of those factors that put you at a disadvantage when you're both exposed to global markets, but you lack the power to participate fully in them? Cesar, good to see you and glad to see you're well. These days, this is the first thing we have to ask, is a person well? And cryptocurrencies, what an interesting situation, huh? First of all, I think, is it a reaction to currency hierarchy? I think it would be really important for us to develop some histories, economic histories of cryptocurrencies, as of course, they're now emerging. But I think that the first idea, there's a kind of libertarian strain that goes through, right? I want to be free of all government interference. And you see this, for example, there's an organization in London called Positive Money, and they were talking about 100 reserve currency banking. In other words, take away from banks the capacity to be able to create credit, to create money. Now, this is in a country where, like in the UK right now, about 95% or more of the circulating money is bank created. But that was kind of this notion of, banks have this special privilege, let's take it away from them. And this idea that the banks have it, the central banks have it, why should the government control us? There's a kind of radical libertarianism. Now, if we go and stay with that, we're going to get to people who are dreaming about degrowth. We're going to be getting to people who are dreaming about circular economies, isolated from the rest of the world. It's important to really work with such people to think about, what are the alternatives? How can we have exchange and an adequate supply of money and finance that is consistent with the broader frame of what, at least for the foreseeable future, will be a global capitalist economy? That's a question, for example, that came up even today in a discussion about circular economy in Yorkshire. And, so I think in some sense, there is some kind of resistance to the hierarchy, not just of currencies, but I would say inside countries, the hierarchies of control. I don't think it was at the level of one country versus another, although, Cesar, I think another thing that might be said is that, first of all, the possibilities for zero-sum gaming in that cryptocurrency market are huge. And there's a lot of people being played for suckers in that market. And secondly, I think that it's fair to say that there's probably a hierarchy of cryptocurrencies that's emerged already. But there's been lots of debate. And as you know, central banks are really afraid, but also trying to exert their force to be sure that the cryptocurrency movement doesn't build much. We're also seeing central banks move toward the idea of digital currency, which gets into the idea of helicopter money and new forms of intervention by central banks in overall economies. But as I think, maybe I'll have a chance to talk just for a minute about it tomorrow, central banks are already deeply involved in the everyday operation of the global international system. Look at what happened when the repo market took a wobble in November 2020. The Fed had to come in to stabilize that because the players who were supposed to keep dancing weren't doing it, and the Fed had to bail them out. So there's something in there that is about this shifting role of the central banks that we have to pay attention to. About the distribution of income and the deregulation of finance, I think it's clear that these things are interrelated. There's some very important work by a guy called Thomas Philippon, several papers talking about the overpayment of people in finance relative to their productivity. And that's, you know, a theme that, for example, is not much talked about by the Tories here, because they don't like to think that the City of London is part of the problem in that respect. But I would just note that I had a dialogue some years ago with Piketty when he had just published his book. We were in Ireland, actually, and debating with the labor unions think tank. And that I had a chance to ask Piketty. I said, look, I'm sitting here talking about, you know, finance and banking and you know, the stuff I talk about, mega banks and so on. You're talking about, you know, the 1%. Aren't we? Isn't this the same conversation? And he made a statement that he said what you would imagine he would say, which is, first of all, he wanted to measure wealth, but he couldn't. The data weren't there to support the same kind of study he wanted to do elsewhere. Secondly, he said that, well, he wanted to keep it simple, to keep the focus on the 1%, on the massive growth of the super rich and the super wealthy. Now, that's a kind of position that he's consistently taken. He's a little bit like Keynes in the sense that he wants to kind of pick his spots where he diverges from, or he explicitly expresses ideas that are ideas that mainstream economists would hesitate about, to try to maintain a broad scope of influence. Broadly speaking, he's been successful, but it does mean that he hasn't closed the gap between what I think is this obvious connection, which indeed Philippon has written about empirically. Okay, I'll stop there because I think that's a good place to stop right now.
Okay, we'll go with another. Ricardo, ¿ya quieres hacer la pregunta en vivo? Ricardo Edmundo. No lo veo.
Doctora, discúlpeme, el doctor Meeting quiere hablar. Entonces
Sí,
yo creo que
lo tengo,
Okay.
veo dos manos subidas. Ricardo Edmundo asks, have you explored any links between general profitability of capital and financial fragility? You describe spreading differentially across space. Then Nancy Belmont, John Smith, and I want to ask at the end. Please, Nancy Belmont, adelante Nancy, por favor abre micrófono y si gusta video para hacer tu pregunta.
Thank you, Doctor. Hi, Professor. I'm glad
Hello.
to see you and hear you again. Yesterday and today, I am thinking of two important ideas to say. The first is Latin American financial drop, and the second is how the capital inflows come and then capital outflows goes. I think it's true that international debt, for example, in Mexico, has been exactly a financial trap, but also I think the internal economic structure contributes to this trap, because the capital inflows that come to Mexico goes to big international enterprises that have the minimum participation at the market, and the economical structure is contributing to that situation. While we have a significant participation of micro enterprises, about 97%, that are precarious and inefficient. So I think there are other factors that are contributing to this trap. Recently, Santiago Levy publishes a book that talks about that. And my question is, what do you think about that internal conditions that doesn't help us to maintain profits and at the developing countries that maybe could help us to get out of the trap.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you. John Smithin, go ahead, please.
Yeah, what I thought I would do, oh, look, here's my nationalistic emblem there.
There you go.
Yeah. So I do want to address this issue of the declining autonomy of, national economic policy, which you've stressed. My own view is that much of this is self-imposed. I mean, for example, joining a currency union. Don't have to do that, right? With respect to Greece, I mean, Greece was mentioned. Well, we've been having this debate ever since the first APF conference in Athens in 1992. And life was good in Athens in 1992. We drank ouzo and we had a swimming pool at the top of the hotel. I think you were there, Naomi, at that conference. Yeah, exactly. Well, the point is, every single dystopian dream that we had, every possible thing that could go wrong 30 years ago has gone wrong. And we were not listened to. And the thing we're doing is say, whatever you do, Greece, don't give up the drachma, you know what I mean, etc. So I've coined this phrase, capitalism in one country, which is a pun on Stalin, obviously, Stalin's socialism in one country, or monetary mercantilism with the emphasis on monetary. And what would be required to restore this national autonomy is, first of all, a political settlement, which, as you pointed out, Gary, is the biggest difficulty that we face. Then a sovereign currency in the MMT sense, and importantly, a floating exchange rate, or at a very minimum, a fixed but adjustable exchange rate, such as you see in China, for example, right? And so the vision would be of rules for monetary policy. Specifically my ZRPR, which is the zero real policy rate of interest, which removes rentier income in two ways. It just makes it zero, right? Similar to Islamic banking. Number two, of course, if the interest rate is, real rate is stick at zero, that reduces a good deal of financial speculation, which is where they gain the wealth in the first place. So you'd have rules for monetary policy, and you would have what Martin Watts calls, one of the MMT group, what Martin Watts calls an agile fiscal policy. Government spending and taxation would be adjusted as necessary. For example, the MMT people think of raising taxes to reduce inflation and so on and so forth. What do you think of that? Isn't that the model that we should be aiming at?
Yeah.
May I ask the last question of this round?
Go ahead.
Gary, when you were speaking, I got the notion that you were speaking about a unipolar power.
Mm-hmm.
I think it looks like lots of regions are constructing, and although the euro wanted to compete with the US, they couldn't, but it looks that China is doing the job. Mm-hmm. This is on one issue. The second issue, very related to what Stefano said. Developing countries are not equal. This is for certain. One thing is Latin America, one thing is developing country from Europe or from the ex-Soviet Union, and the other thing is South Asia. And in this respect, if we see the difference between South Asia and Latin America in globalization, they didn't open up completely because they had a different structure. In these terms, I would go back to, I have a problem with the dependentistas. Perhaps I grew with them up. It's a political issue. Yeah. In Latin America, we haven't had a dominant political alliance that will fight for more domestic-based policy although integrated through the chain values and whatever to the international market. So in technology, for instance, FDIs here don't have any link with domestic markets, which they do have in South Asia. So perhaps there, finally linking with what John Smith said, I think you still have a space of domestic policy within an international, within a globalized world. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. Let me see if we can capture, hold on just a second. Okay, I'm going to go, I think this page. Okay, so first of all, let me get to the question about the profit rate and financial fragility spreading differentially across space. It's a really interesting question. And actually, we were just mentioning Piketty's book. And, Piketty has this, he refers to the provocative idea of, R and G, the different rates of profit and return and so on. And in fact, I'm thinking here of the many reflections of, scholars who've been thinking about the question of the rate of profit in the capitalist economy for a long time. And so in some sense, the question of what's happened to the rate of profit is linked to the question of what's happened to financialization, or how much have corporations been financialized. And I know that, this is something that, again, we would, look at some of the work of some of the colleagues, especially at the New School over the years, who have been analyzing very carefully, how can we measure in value theoretic terms and so on. And that's, something that bears a lot of thought, because one does wonder, if we're looking at, let's say, the profits of a GM or a Ford Motor Company, or of some of the big, so-called non-financial giants around the world, how much of that profit actually is coming from participation in the financial sphere? And are they, to some extent, exaggerating the degree of fluctuation? One thing that we should keep in mind, and I think this was mentioned in the Sunanda. It looks like Sunanda's gone off to bed in India, but she mentioned about the derivatives, the use of these kind of contingent payments and contingent contracts, and definitely, by keep in mind that whenever in a world of shifting currencies and currency values, that as corporations are crossing these borders in order to do their global supply chains and all of that, that they're also taking financial positions that on the one hand provide some insurance, but for every person who's hedging against risk, every company or person, you have another that's taking that risk. And so, that the entire edifice of globalized production, plus the financialization of the non-financial companies, suggests that there probably is a lot that the rate of profit, which after all, we measure very imprecisely. If you remember yesterday, when we were mentioning about that complaint by the IMF, executive at UNCTAD, where he was saying, we don't really even know what's going on. Well, the same question or the same statement could be made about the measurement of profit itself these days. Where is it buried? Where is it declared, etc.? Now, let's turn then to Nancy's question. And thank you, Nancy, for the second day, an excellent question and reflection. I think I'll take your question as more of a comment or an augmentation of what I was thinking of, because actually part of the financial trap definitely is what happens inside the country and the structures there. One thing that we note, I remember, and I can never find work that was done by some colleagues in the University of California. It disappeared from my hands, but I remember studies that were being done by colleagues, I think at UC San Diego, immediately after the tequila crisis. And as you know, as the U.S. banks were coming in and the Spanish banks and all of that, what they were seeing was, among the other effects, was that these banks were not lending in Mexico. They wanted the remittance business, they wanted the consumer credit, they wanted, sort of the, kind of easy money, but they didn't want to get involved with making loans to non-financial corporations to located headquartered in Mexico. They didn't want to get involved in SMEs or certainly in micro enterprise. And so this definitely contributes to the trap. In terms of how to escape it, we have to push against some of these trends and tendencies that we're seeing. We've got the same tendency here in today's conversation in Yorkshire. There was this kind of celebration. My assignment was to talk about finance and the circular economy and the green economy and all that. And just to say, look, we already have SMEs here that are unable to obtain working capital, much less expansion capital. And you're talking about bringing in, 22 billion pounds from the UK Treasury that's going to be spread around the country. Well, hurrah! But that's a needle in this haystack. But basically, we need to bring private capital to the table, get them interested, and who will that be? That's a conversation maybe we'll take up tomorrow a bit. This then takes us to John's comments and the declining autonomy of national policy. Absolutely, something and please, John, don't think, because I think that I stepped across your foot inadvertently yesterday. I don't want to step on you again with suggesting that I was talking about a currency union for Latin America. Not at all, but policy coordination for sure. And you're right that everything that happened has made things worse. And even think about the tortured reflections of Varoufakis in his book "Adults in the Room," thinking about the position they're trying to take. Should they stay in the euro? Should they leave? What's the situation? They were put in an impossible situation that was a subordinate position because of the fact that indeed they were in the position of being a developing country inside the European Monetary Union that lacked the policy autonomy to work its way out of the zone. I remember talking to then I guess soon to be prime minister of the country in 2009, and we had this sort of 2-hour lunch on what should we do. And my first question is, are you going to stay in the zone? Answer was, yes, we are. Well, if you are, I said, we need to get investment from Germany. I mean, basically, we don't have the tools to take autonomous action. That leads to John's thought about the idea of coming up with ways to sort of have to close down the borders. Now, John, I like it when you say monetary mercantilism, the idea of basically selectively closing some of those channels, some of those borders, some of those flows to slow it down, to gain more control over what we're able to do centrally. Actually, I would mention, you mentioned, the exchange rate. You can kind of gain some ability to work with your exchange rate and some of the other factors. And Watts is certainly a great thinker in terms of the options for Europe and so on. Agile policy. I would actually ask people to take a look. There's a very interesting couple of papers by Elias Jabor, who's an economist at UFRJ in Brazil, in Rio, the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He's got a paper, I think, with a couple of co-authors. One of them is with Luis Fernando de Paula, and I think the other is also with a co-author, where they're reflecting on the Chinese model. And interesting thing is that they're raising the question of, is China socialist? And basically, they argue that it retains crucial aspects of planning, that even as China has gone in some sense toward the use of markets and capitalist forms and so on, that you're seeing that kind of a socialism in the sense of control. And of course, right now, President Xi Jinping is sort of exercising that control. Now, there's a discussion about, is that democratic? Is it not? It seems it's not. It's and so on. But that's the question of whether a country maintains the ability to control the pace of its generation of currency, of its generation of means of payments, of its ability to pay for needed public services. This is something that has to be recaptured. And let's look finally at Noemi's question. We have, in some sense, right back to the question of nations and regions trying to work to construct competition for our alternatives to the United States. And, we have this question of basically, can we imagine domestic political alliances that could stand up to this situation? Is there still space for domestic policy? I think there's two things. Yes, there is for sure. One of the things that has to be done, though, yesterday when I mentioned the geography of discontent, we see this voting with anger. To use the sort of, to so to speak, to hell with all of them. I vote against them all. I don't want any of them. John Smith, and I know, has that English flag in his office as an expression of pride in his nation, and probably the performance of the English squad in the recent Euro Cup, and our hopes for them to do better still. But that's one thing, to have that pride in one's nation, and yes, let's solve our problems. And it's another thing to say, let's use that as an excuse to wrap ourselves in that flag and to basically curse those who are not like us. And in some sense, today we were talking about what we call white van man, the small business owners, much like the micro enterprises that you talked about, Nancy, in Mexico, who do maintenance jobs and work and so on. Can we recruit white van man to basically, how about, refitting the housing, to making it future proof, to making it climate part of the circular economy process? I think we have to, because we have to get to the point where people can see their material interest as aligned with taking control and using the vehicles we do have, the policy vehicles we do have and instruments for the good of all the people. This does mean, there's this question about at what point does this thing cease to be capitalist? And I guess it goes back to that question about profit rate and financial instability. What is capitalism now? A question that, say, Paul Mason has posed. And notice that in 2015, Mason writes a book called Post-Capitalism. And right now, he's got a new book about fascism and so on. And so I think that the linking of the two, implicitly, he's moving along that arc from, the dream of the community breaking free of the need to be so connected to the global whole and being autonomous and communal and safe together. And by contrast, we see the concern that this dream will be perverted into an opportunity for authoritarians and anti-democrats to gain control of the levers of government, to use it for their own purposes. Now, how far can that go today? We're not living in 1930s Germany, but at the same time, I should say, every time I talk to Stephanie Blankenberg, and we have time to Stephanie working at the UN, and herself being originally from East Germany, and having grown up there, and at an early age, we talk about the fears that we have about the continuity of experience and the coming back of cycles that we never wish to see repeated again. And this is something that, every time we see a person who's brave enough to call out cruelty for what it is and to stand up for people who are being disrespected, or for standing up for their rights, this is exactly the direction we have to go. And so I know it's not a very coherent answer to your question, Noemi, but we have to fight. And I would just say one final thing. One of the problems we're going to see tomorrow is that the expanse of financial capital let's call it, let's go with Costas for a minute. Let's call it fictitious capital across the world. That, you know, this buildup of trillions of dollars of claims of wealth. This is something that, you know, we've seen actually, you know, some very interesting work by, I think her first name is Katerina Pistor, the legal theorist, talks about the fact that you can turn a legal claim on something into wealth. And we're seeing this expansion of wealth. The things we're talking about are going to slow down that circus, that the circle of expansion of wealth. And it's going to have an effect of shrinking that, you know, fictitious capital in some way. How is that going to be done without destroying the capacity of our global system to survive itself? Do we need all of that fictitious capital? Do we need all those claims that are counterclaims and fictitious claims and contingent claims in order to sustain a world economy that's able to deal with climate change and inequality? There's where, again, back to Dymski, we need a plan to beat a plan. We have to have a plan. And this is where I think, I hope that many of you today will be inspired to go on with this. I'll stop here.
Jorge.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Gary. I want to thank Professor Jonas Meeting for your comments and your questions. And I'm, okay, we have Professor David Barkin. Professor, you can open your mic and your video. Professor Barkin, can you hear me?
David, abre tu micrófono.
No?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry.
There's David.
Harry, it's wonderful to see you. I'm sorry, my technological backwardness made me miss you yesterday. I'm just wondering, and especially given the last series of comments you made, what about the several 100 million people who live in 1/4 of the Earth's surface and who are strengthening their own communities and organizing international networks and are trying to move on the margins of the international capitalist society? How do you see that as influencing the kind of dynamics that you're talking about? Since the impetus for this whole session is geography, these people control 1/4 of the Earth's surface. I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts about what it means for these groups, for the international economy, of the efforts of these groups to do what they're doing?
Thank you, Professor Barkin. Professor Gary Dymski, you have the word.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you know, it's David, I've been reading your work on this, and it's very impressive that, first of all, you've rendered this movement, the cooperative movement, let's call it the self-control movement, visible, and pointed out its extent across the world. I mentioned yesterday the work of my dear friend Jessica Nemhard Gordon, who's written about Black cooperatives and their important legacy in the U.S. And I have to say that yesterday too, we were talking about some of the new impeti for thinking that we see. Let's go just to England for a minute here. That, for example, there's this discussion about the 15-minute neighborhood. What can we do in terms of rethinking the city? Because yesterday, I should note that there was one questioner really threw out the question, the idea of, hey, you know, isn't the city the problem? You keep talking about cities. What about the rural? And one of my responses was that, well, actually, let's rethink the city. And here in Leeds, in the Leeds city region, we're seeing that. Actually, we're seeing new movements that are and everyday people that are recycling food, that are growing their own food, that are exchanging. Exchanges are growing. So there's this kind of nascent possibility for people to pull things out of that capitalist circulation and into localized circulation. I think, if we look back at Paul Mason's book on that there's of post-capitalism, and if we think of some of the other books of like say degrowth books, like say Dan O'Neill, Enough is Enough or something, I think we want to separate two things. There's a critique of the idea that we have enough toys, shouldn't we repurpose things? And for example, in today's conversation, we're seeing an effort by people in the region. This was a Yorkshire Humber conversation of companies that are people who are technical experts and specialists who want to see the idea of repairing, reusing electronic devices, computers, and so on. And they were talking about the challenges they face, whereas some of these media monopolies have, license agreements and restrictions that would make it impossible to reuse once you have, what they want you to buy the new machine, and they're going to sell you that machine and the software that's on it. And so some of these monopolies have to be broken down. But the way that we need, what John Kenneth Galbraith would have called countervailing power. How can we stand up to those monopolies? And I think in some sense, one of the things we're seeing with, say, the UK separating itself from Europe is, we have this initial impulse, global Europe, or excuse me, global Britain. We're going to see global Britain. And they were proudly saying, we're going to have a deal with the United States. Well, was it today or yesterday where Boris Johnson sits down with Biden, President Biden, and Biden's like, not so much. What about the Irish? And of course, that's a contradiction that's unresolvable in the Tory litany. So that, he pressed that sore that won't heal, like, ow, sorry. So there was that. But then, you go to the fact that it's not going to work. Global Britain to what? Ally itself with China, whereas 80% of its trade is with Europe. No, it's not going to happen. But what I think is going to have to eventuate is to see that Britain will realize that it needs to rethink its position in the global system. What about when the city of London is cut off from Europe because of the disputes and all of that? Europe finds its own ways to do its own financial services. The city of London, can we repurpose the city of London to contribute to the global circulation of productive capital as needed, maybe working in a post-capitalist sense? Well, I don't know, but those are the kinds of things we need to get to in order to begin to envision how to take this movement that is spread, and much of which is outside the citadels of power, and to basically make it a part of our everyday thinking. The Labour Party right now in the UK is really divided about whether they should continue to kind of implicitly support the idea, well, we want growth or the city of London's okay, or do they really go with a radical new plan that says, no, let's embrace the regions, let's go and think differently about how growth can happen and what is going to be done with those ex-mining towns and those communities of working class people spread throughout these cities where there are no longer the industrial jobs, and where they have to find their own ways, their new ways to make a living. There will still be trade across borders, as my talk yesterday and my framework shows. But what trade and for what purpose, and how much do we circulate? We go back to, if you remember the Verb-Dorn circle, the virtuous circle of exchange, where in that vision, a high productivity industry worker making, let's say, refrigerators, buys a car, another high productivity industry, and that person buys a refrigerator, another high productivity industry. And all those industries are contained within the borders of our country. And isn't it wonderful? We're growing our way through, virtuous cycles into growth. Well, let's think about what will be the virtuous cycles in a degrowth or circular economy world, and how then could we effectuate that separation, maybe separation of zones, maybe different economic zones. And there's where some of my colleagues at Leeds, Andy Brown and others, are thinking about even how do we redefine value as part of that. So I think there's a lot of thinking ahead of us. I mentioned the New School, and I should have said by name Anwar Sheikh, one of our greatest scholars of capitalism. And Sheikh has worked for years on the problem of moving from labor value to price and back. What about other forms, other ways of seeing and defining value? Can we use these in our everyday life to help to devise a multi-dimensional value system that can coexist with monetized systems and regional, local, and national, international systems as necessary, so that we can all live together? And I think those are challenges that the communities that you work with are posing for people.
Well,
Thank you very much.
but can I?
Go ahead.
The challenge, the dimensions that you're talking about are presuming that somehow within the world that you live in, you can unseat monopoly capitalism, and that somehow that can be reorganized. I'm not very optimistic about that. But what I am optimistic about, and I'm seeing it here, is the ability of these literally hundreds of millions of people around the world to create more, I don't want to use the word autarkic, but to create worldwide alliances in which they work on the margins of the world that you're trying to reform. The degrowth impetus has a very, very profound problem, because they're not dealing with the internal dynamics of accumulation. And what's going on here is the appropriation of the surplus collectively rather than individually for the benefit of the alliances of communities.
Yeah.
Because we know that the people that I'm working with, I'm sorry, not that I'm working with, that I collaborate with, and that are very, very generous about inviting us in, are the ones that have the knowledge that's necessary to counter the environmental crisis that we're talking about and the biodiversity. I understand I'm moving in a dimension that's completely parallel and not even on the agenda of most of the economists. And you're being very generous in giving me this time and space to open this vein of discussion. And I don't think that we can do it. It would be really nice to have another seminar in which we actually have a lengthy discussion of this.
Yeah, I think, just a couple of comments. I led a heterodox bid for what was going to be a network sponsored by the National Research Institute agency in the UK to rethink macroeconomics, and we came in second place. But one of the things, we had some penetration in the end of the discussion, but had we won, we wanted to have a full bore conversation, dialogue, encounter between the people involved in, like Dan O'Neill was at our bid, and some of the, well-known names of people here working on ecological, to really think together about, from, so to speak, let's call it monetary macroeconomics, or the, Dymskian, with people working on ecological, to really have that conversation. That conversation still has to be engaged at all levels. That's the first thing. To think of the models, and there's why that's why I see my colleagues Andy and others pushing this idea of let's think hard about what do we mean by alternative forms of value. And as we work with engineers and others, it's nice because they see the world differently, and we can think of different ways to measure units of things. Second comment is just about my shift from the U.S. and California here. It's interesting for an American to be in a nation that's post-imperialist. I mean, in post-hegemonic, and the sense of limits. You know, Rishi Sunak is warning Boris Johnson about we're spending too much money, not just because he's, you know, a rich man from the financial sector who believes the efficient market's dream, but also that, you know, as Keynes himself recognized back in the mid-century, last century, that, you know, Britain is no longer able to work its will across the world. So one thing I'm interested in here is that, for example, as I've participated on the margin of conversations about industrial policy and so on, strategy, you know, I see the British, you know, the ministries and so on, they're recognizing that, you know, there's most of these industries we don't control. We're not in the driver's seat. You know, we're not including this industry in our plan because we have branches of those companies, but we don't control the thinking centers there. So it's interesting to see Britain, which is proud and has its intellectual centers. And I think that one reason you're seeing a lot of alternative thinking crop up in British universities is that, you know, what does a post-hegemonic nation do? One which actually is connected globally, but which no longer has that ability to extract rents from across the world through its monopoly power. Now, will that moment come where they'll break away from the commanding heights of monopoly capital in the US? And then what's the role of China in that? Huge questions, which are, I would say, above our pay grade, but let's just say that are subject to the vicissitudes of power and uncertainty. But I think by having these conversations at all levels, and let's go back to Stefano's point, that, you know, there are areas in Leeds that are very poor, and that where, you know, people need help and need support, and where there's former working class areas where people are struggling to figure out what to do, how to retool, what's their role, how do we do adult social care, et cetera, how do we grow our own food, and these conversations at every level. And this kind of goes in part to Nancy's comments too, because it's clear that Nancy is working with people there in different levels, that we should stay connected locally, regionally, as well as nationally and globally as we search for solutions going forward. But yeah, David, I think I think that your insistent voice that we need parallel ways of working, and that at the same time, don't ignore capitalism, but take it into account and think about how can one move given this beast. This is part of what we have to hold in our minds.
Thank you, Professor Dymski. Now I'm going to give you the word to Professor Stefanos. If you want something to add to the discussion, you can open your mic.
No, I mean, I'm on the same page.
Okay. Then in order to close this event, I'm going to give you the word to Professor Remy.
Well, I want to thank Stefanos. This is the recognition that the university gives you. I would like to give it in hand. Yes. I don't know whether you're saying it. I will send it to you straight away, but I really want to thank you for your presentation. Thank again, Gary Dymski, and all the participants for this very good session. Me gustaría, bueno, le queremos dar un reconocimiento al profesor Stefanos Llanos por sus comentarios, agradecer nuevamente al profesor Dymski y a todos ustedes que hemos tenido una muy buena atención, y esperemos que mañana nos acompañen a las 11 de la mañana. Usen por favor el link que se envió porque han habido problemas, y les agradezco a todos su participación. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Gracias.
and
See you
good night.
tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. Ciao, ciao.
Thanks again,
Thank you
guys.
so much.
Ciao.
All
Bye-bye.
right. My great
Bye.
pleasure, John.
Bye.
Penny, see you tomorrow. Noemi?
Unfortunately, I
David?
can't make it tomorrow.
I'm
But got another meeting at that time.
We'll carry on